Hi, my name is Nicholas. I am 40 years old. I work as an operations analyst for a shipping logistics company near the harbor, and for 14 years I had been married to Melanie, a port authority officer whose sense of order and discipline once felt like the safest architecture a life could have. We did not have children, and over time our days had arranged themselves into something quiet and repetitive, a pattern so stable that I mistook its predictability for security, the way a man can grow used to the constant hum of machinery and forget that silence might one day fall. The evening the first crack appeared began with nothing dramatic, which is perhaps why it frightened me later, when I understood how easily ordinary life can disguise the beginning of its own collapse. The kitchen was warm, filled with the buttery smell of rice steaming beneath the lid of the pot, and a small lamp near the sink cast a yellow circle of light that softened the edges of the cabinets and turned the window into a dark mirror. Beyond the glass, the harbor exhaled fog in slow, patient breaths, wrapping the cranes and cargo stacks in a blur that made them seem distant, almost imaginary, as if the world itself had taken a step back from clarity. Melanie stood near the counter, already dressed to leave. She had showered quickly, and the citrus scent of her shampoo hovered in the air with a precision that did not belong to the end of a long shift. Her jeans were dark, her boots polished, and the sweater she wore traced her shoulders in a way I recognized from years earlier, from evenings when effort still carried anticipation rather than habit. "I have another inspection tonight," she said, glancing at her watch, then at her phone, whose screen illuminated her face from below, sharpening the line of her jaw. I remember how calmly I accepted the information, how naturally patience rose to meet it, because patience had become my profession inside the marriage long before suspicion ever arrived. I believed in fatigue, in professional burdens, in the way responsibility can hollow a person out until there is little left for tenderness at home. When you live beside a woman who guards ports and paperwork and other people's mistakes, you learn not to demand softness as if it were a right. "Which terminal?" I asked, not because I doubted her, but because I still believed questions were a form of care. There was a pause, and it was small enough that another man might not have noticed it. Yet I watched it unfold with peculiar clarity, like a ripple spreading across still water. "Pier 12, she replied. Her answer came just a shade too quickly, as if the hesitation had required correction. I nodded, and for a moment the house seemed to resume its breathing, the dishwasher humming, the pipes settling, the clock above the stove moving with its usual unearned confidence. Melanie slid her phone into her bag, stepped toward me, and kissed my cheek, but the gesture lacked weight, her lips touching me with the distracted accuracy of someone already halfway down the driveway. Cold air entered when she opened the door, brushed against my ankles, and remained behind after she was gone. A minute later, my own phone vibrated on the table. The notification from the vehicle tracking app glowed in the dimness, a small blue icon beginning to move away from the house, and I found myself staring at it longer than necessary, my mind slow to invent explanations yet unwilling to abandon them. I told myself that I was tired, that routine sometimes rearranges itself without asking permission, that marriages endure stranger seasons than this. Still, as the dot disappeared into fog, a question formed with quiet persistence. Why had that pause before Pier 12 felt rehearsed? Here, the first fracture appears between trust and intuition. Until this moment, Nicholas is still a man of order, someone who believes in professional fatigue, in responsibility, in the logic that long marriages sometimes grow quiet without growing false. But the pause destabilizes that architecture. The first warning sign was already here. The mind immediately begins its rescue operation. It searches for alternative explanations, for misunderstandings, for anything that allows stability to survive another evening. A typical mistake is to think that such details are accidental, that stress or distraction can account for the irregular rhythm of an answer. Yet intuition rarely shouts. It whispers through timing. Nicholas notices not the word, but the correction. And once awareness attaches itself to a moment like that, it never truly lets go. The marriage has not changed yet in reality, but psychologically, a door has opened that will not close again. In the days that followed, I did what men like me have always done when confronted with discomfort that threatened stability. I organized it, labeled it, and placed it somewhere out of sight, trusting that reason would return later to claim it. Morning came with the familiar rituals. I woke before Melanie, listened to the low murmur of the heating system, brewed coffee whose bitterness filled the kitchen with a reliable kind of honesty, and packed my lunch while the early light spread across the countertops in pale, indifferent rectangles. When she entered, already composed, already distant in that professional way she carried even in bare feet, we exchanged the small logistics of married life. Appointments, groceries, the dog food we needed to buy, like colleagues maintaining a shared project. Yet something had shifted, and once I allowed myself to notice it, the shift became impossible to ignore. Her inspections continued to multiply. They appeared at the edges of the week, then in its center, expanding with quiet authority until evenings belonged less to us than to whatever unnamed urgency waited beyond the driveway. She never complained about the added burden, never sighed or rolled her eyes the way she once did when bureaucracy tightened around her schedule. Instead, she accepted the extra hours with a smoothness that felt less like obligation and more like arrangement. I began to observe the details. I noticed how she dressed more carefully on those nights, how her hair remained loose rather than pulled back, how a faint trace of perfume accompanied her departures even though she had once insisted that fragrance had no place at industrial docks. I watched her phone become an extension of her hand, tilting away from my view whenever it lit, her thumb moving with swift, economic precision before the screen darkened again. When I asked whether something special was happening at work, she offered answers that were technically complete yet emotionally vacant, like forms filled out in tidy handwriting but lacking any personal note. New compliance requirements, she said one evening, folding her napkin into smaller and smaller squares. Temporary. Her eyes did not rest on mine long enough to settle. Inside me, hope and suspicion began a slow negotiation, each presenting evidence, each refusing surrender. I told myself that long marriages contain deserts, that affection can recede without disappearing, that loyalty often hides behind exhaustion. But at night, when she returned later and later, carrying with her air that smelled not of metal or salt but of climate control and polished interiors, I lay awake beside the rigid line of her back and listened to my heart rehearse possibilities I did not want to examine. Patience remained, yet it had started to tremble. Patience has been Nicholas's identity inside the marriage, almost a moral achievement he prides himself on. But patience without reciprocity slowly mutates into self-erasure. What we witness now is the transformation of loyalty into anxiety. Melanie's behavior does not provide dramatic proof. It produces accumulation. More care in her appearance, the privatization of the phone, explanations that are complete but emotionally vacant. None of these are crimes on their own. Together, they begin to form atmosphere. Many people choose to remain silent at this point, and in vain. Silence feels noble, controlled, mature. But psychologically, it pushes suspicion inward, where it grows without supervision. Nicholas is still trying to protect the marriage from doubt, yet the effort itself is already isolating him from his partner. The trembling of patience is the beginning of awakening. He is not ready to know the truth, but he is no longer able not to feel it. There is a particular cruelty in the moment when doubt begins to seek verification, because by then a man already understands that he is not searching for reassurance but for permission to stop pretending. The night I finally followed the map began with the same choreography we had practiced for weeks. Melanie showered quickly, dressed with a concentration that excluded me from the room, and announced another late inspection with the professional neutrality of someone delivering weather. I nodded, kissed her temple, and wished her an easy shift, hearing my own voice perform calmness with admirable discipline. When she left, the house expanded. It always did. Rooms seemed to push their walls outward, and every small sound acquired the echo of abandonment. I rinsed our plates, aligned them in the rack, wiped the table twice although it was already clean, and tried to inhabit the role of a husband who trusts his wife because he has chosen to. My phone rested near the sink. I had installed the tracking application years earlier for practical reasons, telling myself that transparency was a form of care, that shared information prevented accidents and misunderstandings. We had both agreed to it almost cheerfully, back when trust felt natural and not like a daily decision. For a long time, I did not touch the device. I walked to the living room, turned on the television, muted it, then turned it off again. I poured myself water and discovered that my mouth was too dry to swallow. Finally, with a calmness so deliberate it resembled ceremony, I returned to the kitchen and picked up the phone. The map opened instantly. Pier 12 lay in darkness at the edge of the harbor. The blue dot that represented my wife was traveling in the opposite direction. At first my mind resisted interpretation. Roads can be complicated, I told myself. Detours exist. Perhaps she needed to stop for fuel or paperwork, or some minor necessity that would soon correct itself. I zoomed out, then in again, following the slow progress of the icon as it moved deeper into the city. Away from water, away from cranes, away from everything her explanation required. I felt no rush of heat, no cinematic surge of betrayal. What I felt instead was a draining, as if gravity had increased and my blood no longer wished to rise. The vehicle stopped. I recognized the neighborhood immediately, an older district renovated into charm, where brick buildings had been cleaned of their history and fitted with expensive windows. Years ago, Melanie and I had celebrated an anniversary there, laughing at the absurdity of ordering wine whose price demanded courage. I enlarged the map until the street names appeared. Then the building, a boutique hotel. The dot remained motionless in its parking lot. Minutes passed with indifferent precision. I became aware of the refrigerator humming behind me, of traffic lights changing somewhere beyond the houses, of my own reflection floating faintly across the glass of the screen. The world had not altered to match the revelation. It continued with its ordinary loyalty to physics. Hope attempted one last defense. Perhaps she was meeting someone about work. Perhaps management used the location for interviews. Perhaps any number of reasonable explanations waited just beyond my imagination. But reason, I realized, requires movement. The dot did not move. It stayed exactly where a man goes when he does not intend to return quickly. I lowered myself into a chair and kept watching, because turning away would have required more strength than remaining. When she came home after 2 in the morning, she entered the bedroom carefully, believing me asleep. She undressed in darkness, slid beneath the covers, and arranged her body along the edge of the mattress with the practiced delicacy of someone who has already chosen distance. I inhaled. She smelled of soap, warm fabric, and a space that did not belong to the harbor. I kept my eyes closed. Somewhere between love and humiliation, a new understanding settled into place. The map had spoken. Technology removes the final refuge of ambiguity. Unlike tone, memory, or interpretation, a location history does not hesitate. It presents repetition, and repetition is devastating because it converts possibility into pattern. Notice that Nicholas does not explode with rage. Instead, he experiences a draining sensation, a gravitational collapse. This is psychologically accurate. When denial finally loses its authority, emotion often gives way to numb comprehension. The fantasy of misunderstanding dies quietly. Hope makes one last attempt, offering logistical explanations, professional necessities, coincidences. But reason requires movement, and the dot does not move. In this moment, Nicholas crosses an irreversible threshold. He is still lying beside his wife, still breathing the same air, yet internally he has exited the shared narrative. Knowledge, once stabilized, separates people more effectively than walls. And it had done so without anger, which made it impossible to argue with. Knowledge changes the weight of ordinary objects. After that night, doors seemed heavier in my hands, cups required more attention to hold, and the act of setting the alarm before bed acquired the solemnity of a ritual performed in a foreign country. I moved through the days with a politeness that bordered on grace, surprised by how efficiently a man can function while something inside him has already collapsed. I did not confront her immediately. Certainty, once obtained, asked first to be carried quietly, as if sudden exposure might still transform it into error. I wanted to observe her with this new awareness, to see whether guilt left fingerprints on routine, whether love even damaged attempted confession without language. Melanie continued her departures. If she noticed any alteration in me, she did not mention it. She discussed grocery lists, fuel prices, a colleague who had mishandled documentation, all with the same measured competence she had always displayed. Yet now I could see the effort beneath the composure, the careful management of eye contact, the way relief softened her shoulders each time I failed to ask where she was going. I began to sleep less. At night, I studied the ceiling and replayed the image of the blue dot resting beside the hotel, its stillness more intimate than any photograph. I wondered about the man who waited there, about the expressions they shared, about whether she laughed in a way I had not heard for years. Jealousy arrived, but it was strangely muted, overshadowed by something larger and more difficult to name. The realization that I had been living beside a private life whose borders I had never crossed. On the fourth day, opportunity presented itself with indecent simplicity. She left her phone on the dresser while the shower ran. Steam drifted into the hallway, carrying the clean scent of shampoo, and I stood outside the bathroom listening to water strike tile, aware that whatever remained of my former innocence depended entirely on whether I chose to move. I moved. I took the phone downstairs and sat at the kitchen table, where we had once planned vacations and argued about paint colors, and I opened the map history with hands that did not tremble. Dates unfolded. Times repeated. The hotel appeared again and again, a pattern too consistent to belong to accident. When the water stopped, I locked the screen and returned the device to its place. By the time she joined me for dinner, I had already crossed the border between suspicion and knowledge, and I understood that the man she believed she lived with no longer existed. This is the psychological death of the former self. Betrayal does not only reveal a partner's secret life. It exposes how much of our own identity depended on believing a certain story about love. Nicholas realizes that Melanie is interacting with a version of him that functioned under trust. That man asked gentle questions, offered patience, interpreted absence as duty. But certainty has replaced interpretation. The old personality cannot survive factual contradiction. Many viewers expect confrontation to be the climax. Yet the deeper shift has already happened here. Once internal transformation occurs, external drama becomes administration. Nicholas is no longer trying to save the relationship. He is observing it from outside, recognizing its mechanics, its evasions, its fragility. Emotional distance has already begun, long before any door closes. Rain began just as I heard the sound of her car in the driveway, a persistent tapping against the windshield that echoed in the quiet of the house. I had left the kitchen light on, the yellow glow spilling into the hallway, and the shadows stretched long across the floorboards. I waited, arms crossed, leaning against the frame of the living room doorway, listening to the soft click of her heels on the tiles. Melanie entered, her coat damp at the collar, her hair clinging slightly to her forehead. She smiled briefly, but it did not reach her eyes. That was the first clue, the smallest fracture in her practiced composure, and I recognized it immediately. The air smelled faintly of rain, wet asphalt, and the lingering perfume she wore only for certain occasions. "Hey," she said, her voice careful, too even. I got caught up at I cut her off with a quiet, controlled tone that made the words feel heavier than the storm outside. "We need to talk." She froze, the movement of removing her coat pausing midair. There was a twitch at the corner of her mouth, and for the first time that week, she faltered. I stepped forward, the boards creaking under my weight, and she backed a step toward the hallway. "I know," I said, and the words did not need explanation. "I know where you've been." Her lips parted slightly, as though she intended to deny, then closed. She glanced toward the living room window, the rain streaming down the glass in long rivulets, and I could see her mind racing, counting possibilities, rehearsing excuses that had no anchor. Nicholas, I can explain." Her voice shook, though she fought it, and she raised her hands in a gesture that could have been surrender or pleading. I shook my head slowly. "You don't need to. I already know everything." Her eyes widened. A flicker of panic crossed her features, followed by the habitual mask she had worn for years. "Everything? That's not true." I gestured toward the phone on the table, the screen still locked. "The history doesn't lie, Melanie. The locations, the times, the repeated visits. I don't need you to confess. I already know who you've been meeting." She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the edge of the coat she still held, knuckles pale. A silence fell between us, broken only by the rain against the windows and the distant rumble of thunder. I studied her closely. The slight quiver in her jaw, the way she avoided my gaze, the tension coiled in her shoulders. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, she whispered. Finally, her voice raw and unsteady. I felt. Felt what? I interrupted, keeping my voice low, controlled. Lonely? Excited? Important? You were already married, Melanie. I was here. She flinched at my words but did not respond. Her silence spoke more loudly than any denial could. I felt my chest tighten, a weight pressing down that was not purely anger, but disappointment, grief, and the hollow ache of betrayal. I moved closer, close enough to see the tiny scratches on her wrists from her nervous habit of twisting bracelets, the shallow rise and fall of her breathing. I need you to leave, I said, not angrily but with finality. I can't do this anymore. Not like this. She looked at me, blinking rapidly, her lips trembling. Nicholas, please. I shook my head. No. I need space. I need the truth to end here. I can't live in the half-world you've created. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing around her. The sound of the rain suddenly louder in my ears, punctuating each word, each finality. She turned slowly, each movement deliberate, her coat slipping from her shoulders as she walked toward the door. Her hand paused on the handle. For a brief second, I thought she might turn, might beg, might try to bridge the gap she had created. But she didn't. She left, and the sound of the door clicking shut behind her reverberated like a bell toll. I stood in the hallway, rainwater dripping from the eaves outside, the house empty except for the echoes of what had been. I felt an unexpected stillness begin to settle into my chest, a quiet comprehension that some moments demand not tears, not anger, but acceptance. The betrayal had been revealed. The confrontation was over. What is striking is not the volume of anger but the emergence of authority. Nicholas speaks quietly, yet he controls the reality of the situation. Betrayal often humiliates, but clarity can restore structure faster than revenge ever could. Melanie searches for language, perhaps for mitigation, perhaps for delay. However, once evidence has replaced doubt, persuasion loses its tools. Nicholas is not debating feelings. He is acknowledging facts. A common misconception is that strength must appear dramatic. In reality, it often arrives as calm refusal. By asking her to leave, he redraws the border of his life. The emotional storm has passed through him already. What remains is boundary, and boundary is the first architecture of recovery. And yet, in that space left behind, I understood the power that belonged to me now, the power to walk away, to define my boundaries, to reclaim my life from someone who had chosen secrecy over partnership. The mornings after she left were quiet in a way that felt strange at first, almost intrusive. I had grown used to the low hum of routine, the soft chatter of someone moving in the kitchen, the brushing of footsteps across the hallway. Now there was only the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my own shoes and the occasional whistle of wind through the eaves. I poured coffee slowly, savoring the bitter warmth, the rich aroma filling the kitchen, and I realized I had not had this kind of unbroken peace in years. I walked to the window, drawing back the curtain slightly, and the sunlight fell in soft beams across the living room. Dust motes floated lazily in the light, and the house felt larger, freer, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. I had always thought freedom would feel like fireworks, a sudden explosion of relief, but instead it was quiet, steady, and grounding. Every breath I took reminded me that I could control my own pace, my own space, my own life. At first, there were moments of loneliness, the sharp reminders of what had been. I would pass the bedroom, noticing the faint indentation in the mattress, the lingering scent of her perfume, and my stomach would tighten with memory and loss. But slowly, I began to notice the small things that belonged entirely to me. The way the sun hit the kitchen in the late afternoon, the neat alignment of books on the shelf, the sound of my own footsteps echoing against empty walls. These were no longer symbols of absence. They were markers of autonomy. I started small, reclaiming rituals that I had let lapse over 14 years. Taking long walks through the neighborhood, stopping at the little bakery around the corner, learning the names of people who worked there and exchanging casual greetings. I found comfort in these brief interactions, in the simple acknowledgement that life moved forward in increments, in the everyday rhythm of ordinary people. It felt like breathing in air I hadn't known was missing. Evenings became mine again. I cooked meals at my own pace, experimenting with spices I had never dared to use before, opening a bottle of wine without feeling guilty about time wasted or energy spent on someone else's needs. Music, once background noise, now filled the apartment with meaning. I noticed the texture of the wooden table, the way my chair fit against my body, the warmth of the mug in my hands, and it all reminded me that I had chosen this life, in all its simplicity, without manipulation or compromise. The divorce was finalized quietly, efficiently. Melanie moved out with her belongings, leaving the rooms uncluttered, and the house felt lighter, as though each box she carried away had lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. There were no arguments, no dramatic confrontations beyond what had already been faced. Only the cold acknowledgement that trust had been broken beyond repair. And in that clarity I found relief. Not bitterness, not rage, relief. I took to the mornings with renewed intention. The first cup of coffee on the balcony, watching the city awaken, the air crisp with possibility, became my ritual of self-possession. I enrolled in a photography class, rediscovering a passion I had abandoned long ago, capturing light, shadows, and the intricate textures of everyday life, the small details that speak volumes when one is truly present. Each photograph, each careful observation, was a testament to my regained attention and autonomy. I began to notice subtle changes in myself. I smiled more easily, though not carelessly. I spoke with clarity, listening to my own thoughts before accommodating the expectations of others. I had developed patience not born of waiting for someone else, but of understanding my own process, my own capacity for growth. The betrayal that had once seemed like a shattering blow now felt like a pivot point, a force that had propelled me toward the life I had been unconsciously craving. One evening, sitting in the quiet of the living room with soft jazz playing, I felt a profound sense of completion. The rain tapped gently against the window, a soothing rhythm, and I realized that I no longer sought validation from someone who had withheld it. I had learned the hard truth. The power to define happiness, boundaries, and dignity rested entirely with me. The house, the city, the ordinary rhythms of life, they were mine to inhabit, unshadowed by deceit or compromise. In these moments, I understood fully the meaning of freedom. Not the freedom of escape, but the freedom of reclamation. Reclaiming time, space, and emotional energy that had been invested in the wrong place. The betrayal had hurt deeply, yes, but it had also forced clarity, sharpened awareness, and revealed my capacity for resilience. I had survived the storm, and the calm that followed was not emptiness, but possibility. I looked around my home, the sunlight glinting on the floorboards, the photographs on the wall capturing everyday wonders, the coffee still warm in my hand, and I smiled softly. This was a life I could build deliberately, consciously, and fully. A life defined not by the actions of another, but by my own choices, rhythms, and integrity. And for the first time in many years, I felt entirely, irreversibly free. Freedom here is not triumph over Melanie. It is reunion with the self Nicholas abandoned in order to preserve peace. The quiet mornings, the coffee, the rediscovered hobbies are not distractions. They are reconstructions of identity. Betrayal forced an audit. He learned where he had accepted emotional scarcity, where patience became avoidance, where love survived without mutual presence. Painful as the discovery was, it restored agency. Many people fear that ending a marriage means failure. Yet remaining inside deception often costs far more. Nicholas did not win back his partner. He won back authorship of his own life. Notice the absence of revenge, of spectacle, of bitterness. What replaces them is proportion. He now understands that dignity is built not from being chosen by someone else, but from choosing himself.